Despite the fact that it seems like a fairly recent phenomenon, there have actually been many times throughout the history of Magic that the community has banded together to collectively say "thing bad," and one of the earliest cases of this was 1994's Fallen Empires, the expansion that almost killed Magic for realsies due to a ridiculous oversupply and an across-the-board powering down of card quality, two things which did not combine well. Many established Magic players had already been playing with Power 9 cards from the base set and ludicrous cards from Arabian Nights and Antiquities for over a year at that point, and after seeing the power level drop in the dark only to bottom out in Fallen Empires, they just had no reason to buy boosters from this set. Thing was though, Magic was picking up in popularity at the time Fallen Empires came out, and comic book stores had bought cases upon cases of supply, which turned out to be catastrophic when everyone hated the set, and the pack soon fell to 88 cents at my local game store. Enter 11-year-old Dev, fresh out of school for summer vacation with a burgeoning addiction to Magic the Gathering but very few cards. When I walked into the game store and saw packs for under $1, my entire world changed, and my infatuation with Magic became a full-fledged love for the game over that summer, as I spent every spare penny I had on pack after pack of Fallen Empires. And so after 25 years, I still have more love for Fallen Empires than most players who remember that time period, because without it, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I'll still defend it to this day too. There were lots of cards in this set that saw high-level play and have transcended into the broader iconography of the game, like Hymn to Torok, Order of the Ebon Hand and its counterpart, Order of Leetbur, Goblin Grenade, and Goblin Chirurgeon for their long-standing playability in Goblin Tribal decks, and of course High Tide for its legendary abusability. Even Dureller and Rainbow Veil have made it into the zeitgeist at this point. And by the way, a quick note, Dureller actually was a great body for its cost back in the day, and it was immune to both Terror and Lightning Bolt, the two most heavily played removal spells in the game next to Swords to Plowshares, so Dureller was actually really good. But anyway, no discussion of Fallen Empire's contribution would be complete without mentioning Ebon Praetor. Look at it. Look at this card. But today we're revisiting Fallen Empires, not for a history lesson, but so that we can re-examine the set through the EDH player's lens before it's lost to time. Up to now, it's been a laughingstock, the joke being that the only reason Wizards released Homelands was to make everyone forget how awful Fallen Empires was, but in the last few years, even the jokes have stopped, and I'm afraid the sands of time will soon wash over my old friend. So today, let's give the set the attention it deserves and talk about the top 10 Commander cards from Fallen Empires. Honorable mention, Turok's Gate. Now, this is a daunting text box, no doubt. That's something we saw an awful lot of back in the day, but for simplicity's sake, all you really have to know is that this is a 3-mana aura that enchants a land, and you can tap a land that you put it on to give your attacking creatures +2/-1 until end of turn. The complex part of this has to deal with the time counters aspect of it. It doesn't come into play with any time counters, and you're supposed to remove a time counter during your upkeep or you sacrifice Turok's Gate. But if you sacrifice a Thrall, these meant-to-be sacrificed creatures from Fallen Empires, you put 3 time counters on Turok's Gate, which gives you a whole bunch of turns to use this amazing Anthem effect. Yeah, it does give all your creatures -1 in the toughness department, but it's not too hard to plan for that. And when you get the +2 bonus, all you really have to have are a fair number of relatively small creatures with at least 2 toughness, and you're getting in for an awful lot of damage. I can't really in good conscience put this on the actual list, but it is a card that I want to shed some light on, because even if you have to effectively pay 4 mana, the 3 mana plus the land that you tap, you'll get this for at least 1 turn, even if you don't have any Thralls to sacrifice, and +2 in the power department is relatively high in terms of Anthem effects, especially surprise Anthem effects. So I kind of like this in mono-black commander decks that play an awful lot of the right-sized creatures for it, but that's a relatively narrow way to use the card. Number 10, Initiates of the Ebon Hand. I actually just brought this card up in a video the other day. I was talking about the top 10 beta cards under $10. When I brought up Drain Life, I mentioned that if you have a bunch of artifacts like Soul Ring, Grim Monolith, Basalt Monolith, on and on and on, there are tons and tons of these, that produce colorless mana, well, you can filter it into Initiates to cast a huge Drain Life. Well, it turns out you can do that with Initiates no matter what you need black mana for, even if it's not a giant Drain Life or whatever. If you just have all these mana-producing rocks laying around, but you need black mana to actually cast your spells, Initiates is a great one-drop to ensure that you can actually filter all of that excess mana into castable spells. So I don't usually love one-drops in Commander that aren't really impactful, but again, if you have enough mana rocks and enough to do with the mana, then Initiates can actually come in handy to making sure you have the mana needed to actually cast the spells in your hand. Number 9, Elvish Farmer. Now, I'm looking at this card not so much for its ability to produce saprolings, it only does so once every 3 turns, not a very good rate in Commander, but the second ability on the card is going to be pretty good in any of your saproling decks, of which there are a startling amount in Commander, and if you just wanted another thing that sacrifices saprolings for value, look no further. This is a great addition to your saprolings deck because for 0 mana at instant speed, you can get life off of sacking your saps, and that can get you out of a whole lot of jams. Plus, you get this amazing Richard Kane Ferguson art. Number 8, Night Soil. Speaking of saprolings, this can be a great way to generate extra saprolings. It's just 2 mana to get down, and yeah, you have to pay 1 mana to activate it from then on out, but that's not actually too much to ask. Especially if you top deck it in the late game, you can immediately get a ton of saprolings, because there's sure to be a lot of creatures in graveyards at that point, especially in a Commander game where you're playing with anywhere between 4 and 8 players in total. Just creatures in graveyards are everywhere, so Night Soil can sometimes come down and generate, if you have enough mana, tons and tons of saprolings. But even a turn 2 Night Soil will set you up to generate lots of saps over the course of the game. So if you're looking for another creature factory in your saprolings decks, Night Soil is an amazing choice. Number 7, Homarid's Spawning Bed, another creature factory, and there's actually going to be multiple creature factories on the list, and I kind of rate them all together, but there are going to be a lot of situations where you've got one big creature, but what you really need is a bunch of little creatures, whether you're trying to go wide on an opponent and get through their defenses, or you have, say, an Ashnod's Altar, right? A Leviathan might only be worth 2 mana when you sacrifice it to an Ashnod's Altar, but if you sacrifice it first to Homarid's Spawning Bed, suddenly you're going to get a huge return when you go to sacrifice those tokens to Ashnod's Altar. So in any situation like that, Homarid's Spawning Bed is actually an amazing card despite the relatively high investment it costs to activate it. Number 6, Goblin Warrens. You may have heard of this card before, and actually it could be a little bit higher up on this list, but I feel like the fact that it's already gotten some exposure actually means that it's not so much of an under-the-radar thing that I need to point out so everyone knows it exists. Plenty of Commander players already are aware of how good Goblin Warrens is, but it absolutely needs to be on the list if for no other reason than that. Again, this requires a relatively high mana commitment, but if you have enough mana, or in some cases infinite mana, you'll start generating infinite goblins, because obviously once you sacrifice a couple of goblins, you can sacrifice 2 of the tokens that you made with Warrens to make 3 more tokens, sacrifice 2 of those tokens, make 3 more tokens. So again, if you have infinite mana, especially infinite red mana, then it's very easy to make infinite creatures with Goblin Warrens. But even in just a regular old Goblin Commander deck, you'll find plenty of reasons to want to sacrifice goblins during combat steps or in response to removal or whatever, making sure that if your opponent tries to lightning bolt your important goblins, you can still replace their power and then some is actually an important reason to keep 3 mana open when you've got Goblin Warrens out. This card can just be really difficult to get over because even if your opponent does have removal for your goblins, they never actually have removal for your goblins. Number 5, Felonite Druid. The only reason this card is all the way up here on the list is because this is one of the first cards that I tried super hard to build decks around, but we really didn't have too many rampant growth type effects back in the day. Thing is though, we do now. There are tons and tons of ways to put extra forests into play, right? Whether you're doing it with, say, Nissa's Triumph, or really I could go on and on and on forever. Things like Cultivate, and circuitous routes, stuff like that. Again, we've seen these ramp cards. There are literally, I was going to say dozens, but more factually, there are likely hundreds of these ramp cards that put extra lands into play now, and very often they're green, so it shouldn't be too hard to make sure that those things are forests. This is not quite Nissa Who Shakes the World or anything, but rather than turning all of your forests into creatures over the course of many turns, this can turn all of your forests into creatures in just 1 turn, which is actually really, really sweet if you're trying to get through a big attack step. Of course, you got to worry about your forests dying during attacks and all that, but if all you need is one more big push to get through the enemy's defenses, sometimes this can be a great way of doing that. Number 4, Goblin War Drums. I never really appreciated how good War Drums was back in the day, although my friend did have a Goblins deck with a couple of copies of War Drums in it, and this card has beaten me on multiple occasions, so I don't know why I never really recognized how good the card is. I guess it needed to be put in context of an actual keyword ability, which it is now. This is basically, despite all the text on the card, creatures you control have menace, which is actually not really bad on a 3-mana enchantment that's going to be relatively tough to deal with if you have enough creatures. Number 3, Soul Exchange. This is actually a really awesome reanimative piece right here. Just 2 mana to get a creature out of your graveyard. That's really, really good. You have to sack and effectively exile one of your own creatures. Don't worry about the Thrall text on this. It's just gravy if you have a Thrall. It's still a good card if you don't, because again, 2 mana for a reanimation spell is a really good rate. This kind of feels like a Blood for Bones that only costs 2 mana. Yeah, you don't get another creature back and put it in your hand. Whatever, it doesn't matter. 2 mana is still an amazing rate for effectively return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, because on turn 1, you can pretty easily filter a giant creature into your yard, depending on your commander deck. And then, on turn 2, Soul Exchange it out. Just imagine Stitcher's Supplier. On turn 1, put a big guy in your graveyard. Turn 2, Soul Exchange. Not going to happen every game, but it's definitely a playline that can happen. So Soul Exchange is actually a pretty exciting card. Even if you don't play it on turn 2 after a huge dump on turn 1, that sounded weird. But even if you don't do that, if you get it on, say, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, you can still have extra mana to play other spells and follow up reanimating a giant creature, which is also important to think about. So I just really like Soul Exchange. The rate on this is phenomenal. Number 2, Sea Singer. Now, this was almost number 1, but the restriction of your opponent having to have an island really cuts the playability of the card. That said, I still think it is one of the strongest cards in the set for commander play. It's effectively a Mtg Rebarret that you don't put in your commander slot. It's just a regular old card, and that's really dope. Even if your opponent doesn't have islands, which honestly shouldn't be too much of a problem. A lot of commander tables have a ton of islands at them, but just in case an opponent has something juicy that you want to steal with this, but they don't have any islands, use something like Phantasmal Terrain or one of the many cards like this to turn one of their lands into an island, and then suddenly Sea Singer can steal anything that you wanted to. Just keep Sea Singer tapped down, and you get to keep their creature forever until they're able to remove Sea Singer. Again, this is very reminiscent of Mtg Rebarret, one of my favorite commanders of all time, but it's not a commander. You just get to play this card in the 99 like it's no big deal. I guess you could do that with Mtg too, but you could play this card in your Mtg deck and effectively have a second copy of it, so long as your opponents have islands. And again, that happens a lot more often than you'd think. But let's get to number 1, and old school players from that time period will note that I didn't bring this card up when I was talking about iconic Fallen Empires cards at the beginning of the video, but that's because I wanted to save Hand of Justice for the end here. This is easily, to me, the number 1 card in the set for commander play, even though effectively having to have 4 creatures, 3 other creatures and a Hand of Justice to tap, seems like a kind of tall order. There are tons and tons of tokens decks, whether they're mono white, Naya, Selesnya, Orzhov, whatever, that can make very good use of Hand of Justice, because maybe you can't break through the line or whatever, but you've got tons and tons of creatures out. You might as well tap some of them to get rid of the juiciest threats on the table. Can't steal them like Sea Singer can, but at the same time, this can just Avatar of Woe other creatures off of the board, which is a very important ability to have. Hand of Justice, again, it looks like you need a lot of creatures out to actually proc this, but in the decks that want to play Hand of Justice, it's a lot easier than you might think to create a few tokens. But that is my top 10 for Fallen Empires. Thank you very much, by the way, to my patrons for letting me do this video. When I put it on the Patreon poll, I didn't think it was going to win, but I was really stoked when it actually did. Again, thank you for letting me talk about one of my favorite sets in Magic history. That is, again, kind of a laughingstock to a lot of players, but it means a lot to me because it's a set that I started playing Magic with. And of course, old-timers like me, or if you're just familiar with Fallen Empires, you don't have to have been playing when the set was fresh. Get down there to the comments section, let us know what your favorite Fallen Empires cards are if I didn't bring them up in this video. Or even if I did, just keep talking about the cards. Shed more light on this set before everyone forgets about it forever. But aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications, go over to the Patreon, link in the description to vote on content like I alluded to earlier, and of course you can hit the first link in the description to go to a list of the cards we talked about today on TCG Player and pick up anything you need for EDH. But that's pretty much it for this one, y'all. Hope you enjoyed it. I finally got to talk about one of my favorite sets ever that like no one else likes, but I think there's plenty of reasons to like it. So again, do all the YouTube stuff, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.